Senior analyst for Ethiopia in the International Crisis Group, William Davison, is joining me now virtually from Nairobi for an update. William, good afternoon. Welcome to today. Thank you very much for your time here on ENC. Well, the talks are underway. It's day 3. Can we realistically expect, I don't know what is the sense you are picking up around these talks, because the media has been barred from attending inside. So there's a kind of a media blackout. But from the outside, the media has witnessed that the various role players are in Pretoria meeting. Can we expect some progress that will lead towards a meaningful and lasting peace?
Well, it's early days, obviously. I think the positive... most positive aspect is that these talks are occurring, and I've been told that the Tigray and federal delegations are in direct talks, and they've sort of stated their positions to each other. So there's certainly no outcome yet. Of course, the big initial hope here is that we can get a cessation of hostilities agreement and stop the fighting, because currently there is still plenty of active hostilities inside Tigray with the federal government and its Eritrean allies essentially attempting to take control of the region, and there being continuing resistance from Tigray's forces, despite some recent setbacks they've suffered.
Yeah, just to remind our viewers, what has led to this conflict that's been going on for over 2 years now?
Very bitter political dispute between the federal and the Tigray leadership. Tigray's leaders were influential in the federal system. Before Abiy Ahmed, the prime minister, took power in 2018, they had a very bitter falling out that culminated in a constitutional dispute after Tigray tried to autonomously run its own regional election in defiance of federal authority, and that paved the way for war. And then Eritrea's role is really because of the deep enmity between President Isaias and the leaders in Tigray of the TPLF. They used to be allies, but they fell out most spectacularly over the 1998 Ethiopia-Eritrea war.
Okay, so what can we are outside. We'll have to wait and see if the AU will issue a communique, because South Africa is hosting these talks in Pretoria on behalf of the African Union. What could be the sticking points? I mean, what will be the main issues that might be the sticking points as they're trying to find each other and resolve the conflict?
The main initial problem is that the federal government stated intention to control all federal facilities inside Tigray. That is likely to be resisted by Tigray's leaders. They will continue their armed resistance and will not allow the federal government to try and impose a settlement. That is the initial obstacle to getting to a truce. There are also very serious territorial issues that have developed during this war, with Amhara region taking over a portion of Tigray. And that is a major point of contention. And then there is the role of Eritrea. Eritrea seems to be intent on completely removing Tigray's leaders from power. And they have so far shown no interest in a negotiated settlement. And so these are just the types of obstacles that lie in the path of peace.
Okay, so just a thought that just popped in my mind. And if I'm a viewer now watching this conversation, I'll be thinking, does Tigray, or do the people of Tigray have a legitimate right to be wanting self-determination?
Of course, these questions are highly subjective. They are the subject of political debate, and at the moment, unfortunately, they're the subject of war. What we do know is that Tigray does have a long history of relative autonomy. We know that the people and the leadership seem to be fairly united in resisting what they see as the imposition of a settlement by the federal government, and certainly resisting the type of atrocities that are being committed during the war. We also know that Ethiopia's current constitution does promise untrammeled self-determination, really, for groups, even up to and including secession. So, of course, there will continue to be arguments over self-determination or autonomy, but there is a lot of weight, both historical and contemporary, behind the Tigrayan sort of self-determination demand and struggle.
Yeah. How strategic is Tigray in the Horn of Africa as a unit, as a unitary state, let's say, for argument's sake?
It's in a critical position, I suppose, because it borders Eritrea, it borders Sudan as well. And that area with Sudan, both on the Ethiopian side and the Sudanese, that is very the subject of fierce debate between Ethiopian groups, Amhara and Tigray, also between Ethiopia and Sudan. I think the fact that Tigray's leadership, the TPLF, was so powerful in Ethiopian politics and in regional politics and in security structures, peacekeeping, the Ethiopian army, that makes Tigray a significant region. And also because it is now the focal point of this power struggle between the Tigray leadership and the federal leadership, but also between President Isaias and the TPLF, it has now become very important to the regional political scene.
Yeah, and some recent conflicts in Africa, historically, in recent history, have also been about mineral resources, about access to resources. Is Tigray a very rich area from what you know, different aspects? I mean, I'm asking this because sometimes the genesis of a conflict might be more than just political.
I think that the roots and the causes of the conflict are, as I've described, power struggles between political elites, arguments over autonomy and this type of thing. Of course, resources and economic considerations are there. This area of Western Tigray that Amhara has taken over, that is a relatively fertile sesame exporting part of Tigray. Also an area in southern Tigray is another fertile agricultural area. And then there certainly are deposits of gold and other precious metals and minerals, which people may have an eye on in terms of the future commercial possibilities there. But I would say primarily this is a political struggle. But of course, those types of resource questions underlie political disputes. Yeah,
and where do the guns come from? I mean, Tigray is a region up north there, as you've explained, in Ethiopia. The Ethiopian government, of course, has got its defense force. Do we have any clues funding the Tigrayan fighters?
Primarily, one thing we haven't mentioned here is that really throughout this war, especially when the Tigray leadership has been in charge of the region, essentially the federal government has imposed a blockade upon it. So no trade access, transport, no services, including banking, and heavily restricted aid as well. So Tigray has not had access to the international arms market to any sizable degree. There were some aerial deliveries earlier this year, but we're not really sure where they came from, probably light arms. But it seems that the arms that the Tigray forces have, they've either stockpiled or they've commandeered during the war after winning battles against the Federal Eritrean and Amhara forces. So that is the three main sources. But certainly the Tigray leaders claim that most of the weapons they have captured in battle.
Okay. Finally, William, South Africa's role. I mean, South Africa is hosting these first formal negotiations between the warring sides in Pretoria here on behalf of the African Union. A former deputy president of South Africa, Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, has joined the former Nigerian president, who's the main envoy of the AU, that's Olusegun Obasanjo, together with the former Kenyan president, Uhuru Kenyatta. The choice of Pretoria as a venue for these formal talks, what's the significance of that? I mean, from an international perspective, when you are watching these talks taking place in South Africa, all the way far from the Horn of Africa, what's the significance of that?
It's a sign that Africa's heavy hitters are getting involved. So far, we've seen relatively ineffective efforts from the African Union and envoy Obasanjo. The US has been involved, but obviously it's restricted in what it can do. So I think the hosting of the talks, involvement of the South African Kenyan leaders is a sign that African leaders are beginning to take this conflict much more seriously, which is absolutely necessary. I also just wanted to mention that at the beginning of the conflict, Tigray's leadership moved against a federal military command station inside Tigray as they feared federal intervention. So they did capture a large stockpile of weapons then.
Yeah, okay. We're going to have to wait and see what happens in these talks, if they produce any form of a truce, which from what you've told us, it could be a challenge, a big one, but we have until Sunday, and maybe we'll find out afterwards. And I would love to pick your brains after maybe next week, William, again here on Today, to say about the outcome of these talks in Pretoria. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon here on Today on ENCA. William Davidson, Senior Analyst for Ethiopia, of the International Crisis Group, talking to us all the way from Nairobi in Kenya. One of the facilitators of these peace talks in Pretoria is the former Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta.